for the ICNC Academic Webinar with Dr. Jason MacLeod, who is conducting research on the viability of nonviolent strategies and tactics to enlarge the prospects of the self-determination in West Papua. In this webinar, Dr. MacLeod will talk about why civil resistance praxis is clear that unarmed civilians can go outside conventional political processes to overthrow dictatorships and usher in policy change. Dr. Jason MacLeod teaches civil resistance at the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. He also taught at the University of New England, Christian Heritage College, and was an honorary research fellow at Monash University. He obtained his doctorate from the University of Queensland in Brisbane, where he examined the viability of civil resistance strategies to enlarge the contours of self-determination and political freedom in the Indonesian-occupied colony of West Papua. He is the author of several articles and book chapters on West Papua and nonviolent struggle. He is also the forthcoming author of America and the Morning Star, Civil Resistance in West Papua. And I will now pass all the controls over to Dr. MacLeod, and he will begin his presentation.
Terrific. Thanks very much for that, David, and hello to all of you listening, wherever you are in the world. It's good to be with you. As David said, my name's Jason MacLeod, and I want to begin with a traditional West Papuan greeting. Wah, 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 wah. And I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners in the place I'm meeting, which is Brisbane. And here it's Jagera, Yagara and Yugarabal peoples, and I'd like to acknowledge the First Peoples in your part of the world, wherever that is. And to acknowledge our elders, past, present and future. So as David said, I'm going to be presenting a webinar looking at self-determination struggles, and my basic argument is that self-determination struggles are underdeveloped both in terms of practice and research. And what I'm going to propose today is a draft conceptual and practical framework for what I hope will maximize the effectiveness of self-determination struggles. Okay, so the outline, I'm just briefly going to present the research methodology that led to this webinar. I'm going to discuss what I mean by self-determination struggles. I'm going to look at the evidence so far in relation to the effectiveness of civil resistance and armed struggle to win self-determination struggles. And then I'm going to propose a working hypothesis, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail soon. Then I'll look at some next steps, where the research might go to from now, and I'll conclude with suggesting or proposing that self-determination struggles is a new and important frontier of civil resistance praxis, so both the theory and research, but also the practice of self-determination. Okay, the research methodology. So this research has come about through action research, and it was action research that accompanied the struggle for self-determination. I'm a great believer that academics need to be relevant, and to do that, to ensure that the research was actually useful to the people I was working with West Papuans, I wanted to do that in a very engaged way. So the research took place over 14 years and across a number of different sites. I essentially followed the struggle, and in many cases that meant accompanying West Papuan leaders in various places around the world where they were waging their struggle for self-determination. To do this, I used a combination of various methods: applied ethnography, popular education, action learning, and comparative research. And initially it was focused on West Papua, and still is focused on West Papua, but now looking at actually testing this hypothesis in relation to a range of other self-determination struggles. Okay, so what do I mean by self-determination struggles? In this webinar, I'm really talking about a particular kind of self-determination struggle, and these are large-scale struggles for independence, or secession. And in many cases, they involve campaigns or movements to bring about an end to what the resisting population perceives as a foreign occupation. So examples is West Papua, and this webinar will draw heavily on that struggle, which I've been closely involved with. Palestine, Tibet, Western Sahara, Mahanui, which is also known as French Polynesia, Kanaki, Bougainville, Nagaland, and a range of other places around the world. Particular limitation of this research, I'm not looking at more localized indigenous self-determination struggles. So for instance, not looking at struggles waged by indigenous people in the south of Mexico, like the Zapatistas, and other places for enlarged autonomy within a particular state or across states. Okay, so let's look at the evidence so far. Now, much of this research will be familiar to those of you listening, and I'm drawing here from Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen's fantastic study, and their book published in 2011. And now their data set was 323 large-scale struggles waged between 1900 and 2006. And they found, or the findings of the research is that civil resistance is more than twice as effective as armed struggles. So they found when they compared all these different violent and non-violent struggles that civil resistance struggles succeeded 53% of the time. And armed struggles waged through armed resistance succeeded 26% of the time. Now that data set includes anti-dictatorship or pro-democracy struggles, anti-occupation and secessionist struggles. They're all aggregated together. However, when we, in relation to self-determination struggles, when we desegregate that data, so when we look at the difference between anti-dictatorship, anti-occupation and secessionist struggles, the results are far less promising for self-determination struggles. And basically, these kind of struggles succeed far more than they fail. So for the purpose of this webinar, I'm actually referring to self-determination struggles as anti-occupation and anti-secessionist struggles. When Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen looked at that, they looked at anti-occupation struggles. They found that they succeeded 35% of the time for non-violent resistance and 36% of the time for armed resistance. And that's not statistically significant, that difference of 1% there. The success rates for secessionist struggles, however, and these are 45 struggles out of the data set, you know, the margin for success decreased quite dramatically for those struggles. So it's 10% success rate for armed struggles and 0% for secessionist struggles waged through non-violent resistance. But look, there's just a note of caution there. The distinction between anti-occupation and secessionist struggles is contested. And, you know, so for instance, in their research, Chenoweth and Steffen referred to the East Timorese struggle and the West Papuan struggle as an anti-occupation struggle, whereas many would refer to it as a secessionist struggle. So those figures might, that figure of 0% for non-violent resistance might actually change. And also the data is skewed by the Cold War era when you had both the United States and the Soviet Union sponsoring liberation struggles in a range of different places. And that's no longer the case. All right, so let's look now at why self-determination struggles are much more difficult to win. First of all, that they involve difficult goals. So overthrowing a dictatorship is hard enough, and you can see how difficult that is in relation to the struggles underway in the Arabs that have continued after the Arab Spring. But when it comes to actually self-determination struggles, whether that's removing a foreign occupier or trying to secede from an existing state, it's much, much more difficult. Second, there's higher stakes involved. So in the case of West Papua, that includes not only tearing at the fabric of Indonesian national identity, it also involves a contest over who controls the country's massive resource wealth. And we need to remember, in the case of Indonesia, it's an important ally for the United States, Australian, and various European countries, and it's also a growing economic power in the region. Thirdly, self-determination struggles often involve different and contested interpretations of history. So in the case of West Papua, the Indonesian government's interpretation of history is starkly different from the West Papuan interpretation of that history, and that's true for a range of other struggles. The colonizers and the resisting population look at history very, very differently. Fourthly, and related to that third point, self-determination struggles are often sites of contestation over values and identity. And in the case of West Papua, Melanesian identity until very, very recently, in fact, was criminalized. And for a large part of recent history, West Papuans weren't even allowed to refer to themselves as Papuans or Melanesians. And then finally, self-determination struggles are affected by variables outside of their control. And I'm going to talk about that a bit later. But the key point here is that the sources of power are often external, or some of the key sources of power, rather, are often external to the occupied territory. And self-determination struggles also challenge the interests of the international community, who more often than not don't want to see new states emerge. Okay, so let's go now to the hypothesis. Now, you can see up on your screen that I'm proposing this as a formula, but in actual fact, it's probably shorthand. It's not really a formula. Consider each of these component parts as being important things to consider when either researching or waging a self-determination struggle. And I'll talk about each one in more detail soon. And I suppose you could also look at them as kind of mechanisms, which is as used by people like Doug McAdam and Charles Tilley and Sidney Tarrow. Okay, so let's look at what I mean by this. So mass, that refers to participation, both the numbers of people and also the types of groups that are participating in the struggle. Momentum, that's a shorthand for strategy, having a coherent plan of success. So strategy is what gives the mass momentum. And the effectiveness of mass and momentum is multiplied to the extent that there's unity between the different components of the struggle. Now, organized people and strategically applied extra-parliamentary collective action needs to take place in three domains. So in the case of the West Papuan struggle, what I mean is West Papua, Indonesia, and internationally. And I'll talk more about those domains later on. Diplomacy, so all struggle waged outside the conventional political system also needs to be augmented by diplomatic efforts and the ability of movements to minimize threats and take advantages of political opportunities. So together, this is kind of like a grand strategy or a conceptual framework, and and the importance of these component parts will differ slightly depending on the struggle, but I argue that in the case of self-determination struggles, movements really need to consider each one of these elements. All right, so let's look at each one of those things in a bit more detail now. Okay, so let's look at mass. First of all, we're talking about more numbers. Now, again, many of the listeners will be familiar with this. You know, in the case of France in 1789, 2% of the population was enough to bring about revolutionary change. In the case of the Soviet Union, in 89, you know, less than 1% of the population participated in overthrowing communism there. People like Lichtbach, you know, argue that rarely does participation in large-scale social movements ever rise above 5%. Erica Chenoweth, looking at the data in the NAVCO data set, which is a nonviolent action and violent outcomes conflict outcomes data set, she says that about 3.5% participation is often sufficient to bring about change, particularly in self-determination struggles. Now, particularly in anti-dictatorship struggles. In relation to self-determination struggles, as I said before, they're much more difficult to wage. So, for instance, you know, you look at those figures from France and the Soviet Union that I mentioned before, and their percentages based on the national population. So, you know, in West Papua, at the peak period in the struggle, mass participation, so the number of people on the streets peaked at around about 50,000 people, and that was during the Second Congress in 2000. So that's probably, you know, anywhere between 2.6 and 3.3% of the West Papuan population. But if you look at the total national population of Indonesia, an Indonesian population is in excess of 200 million people. 50,000 people on the streets of Port Numbai or Jayapura, the capital of West Papua, translates to 0.02% of the total Indonesian population, which is really hardly a threat to Indonesian government rule, particularly if there's no simultaneous agitation on the streets of Jakarta and in other places in Indonesia. So this is one of the reasons why Jakarta has effectively been able to ignore the West Papuan struggle. They just don't pose enough of a threat, and it hasn't been worthwhile the regime's expending political capital. Anyway, I'll keep going. So you also need more diverse groups. So if we look at the Achinese self-determination struggle, and as many of you would know, they received an enlarged autonomy, but not independence. Participation there was anywhere between 16 and 50% of the Achinese population. In East Timor, it was probably a lot higher. In South Sudan, it's difficult to get exact figures on this, but if you look at the referendum, you had 98% of people participating in the referendum who voted for independence. And you had a huge cross-section of the population. So diversity is important. Thirdly, and this is where it differs from anti-dictatorship struggles, you need to actually build mass in both the occupied territory, in the territory of the occupiers, which is in the case of West Papua, Indonesia, and also in various sites within the international community, particularly those countries that support Indonesia or support the occupier, and those countries which are important realm of influence. And I'll talk about that a bit more later on. All right, I'm going to skip this slide. I could speak about this in a lot more detail, but I won't for now. except to say that it's really that community organising has a lot to offer self-determination struggles, and it's vital that leaders pay attention to relationships within organisations as well as between struggle organisations, that they kind of draw people in through appealing to their self-interest, that a lot of effort is spent in developing new leaders and particularly recruiting new leaders. And that there needs to be a structure that is both decentralized and coordinated. People like Kurt Schock have done really good work on that. And then finally, movements need to pay attention to culture, looking at the subjective emotional experiences, the ideologies, the folk traditions, the organizational structures that support mobilization. John Foran, who's done a lot of work on revolution, has good stuff on that. So has Jean-Pierre Reid. Okay, all right, so let's move to strategy now. We're going to take a look at some of the theory. So obviously strategists need to pay attention to the consent theory of power. Now, in the case of self-determination struggles, it's absolutely vital that strategists and leaders look at the external sources of power. And the work of Robert Burrows is particularly important here, and he argued for a modified consent theory of power, and he built on Gene Sharp's work. Of course, strategists need to look at how change will come about. In the case of self-determination struggles, it's normally disruption of the opponent's power base, much more so than coercion or accommodation. Certainly that was the case in the Baltic states. It was the case in South Sudan, in Kosovo, East Timor. All those examples of successful self-determination struggles. Movements need to look at tactics, and they also need to develop resilience to repression. Now, there's an article that I wrote about this in the last edition of the Resistance Studies Journal, which looks at strategic, tactical, organizational, individual ways to develop resilience and also ways movements can prepare. Now, all of this contributes to an analysis, and an analysis informs strategy. Now, there's plenty of other people who've looked at the role of strategy. One of them is Rob Burrows, and he's got, again, I won't speak about this in great detail because I want to get to other parts of the framework, but he's got 12 key elements that he says are important for strategists to consider. And again, I refer you to his book, published in '96. And that's going to be in the reference list I'll provide at the end. Okay, unity. Now, people like Peter Ackerman and Hardy Merriman have done a lot of really good work on this. And again, this will be familiar to most of you. So purpose is important. Now, Benny Wender, who's a leader of the West Papuan struggle, talks about having a shared agenda. So he's really emphasized the importance of unifying around higher order strategic goals. So rather than getting caught up on particular strategies to bring about self-determination, Benny Wender is focusing on self-determination as a kind of frame that can bring people together. Obviously, planning is very critical in terms of supporting unity, and so too is organisation. In the case of the West Papuan struggle, the United Liberation Movement for West Papua is recently formed, and here you can see like when you look at the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, you can really see the role that mediation, reconciliation, and various conflict transformation approaches have in relation to civil resistance. So inside West Papua, young people played a really important role, particularly young mid-level leaders, in bringing together different parts of the movement. And outside the country, the church played a very significant role, particularly the Pacific Conference of Churches. They helped facilitate different components of the struggle coming together in Vanuatu. The Vanuatu Council of Churches played a very, very important role, and then so too did the Council of Chiefs in Vanuatu and, of course, the government there. So again, you know, an interesting relationship between conflict transformation, peace building, community organizing, and civil resistance. Okay, let's look at domains. So when I talk about 3 domains, you can see up on the screen there's the occupied territory, the occupier's territory, and the societies of the occupier's elite allies. Okay, so another example, let's take Palestine. Palestine, the occupied territories, obviously Gaza and the West Bank, you know, the various Palestinian territories, Jerusalem, you know, places like the occupier's territory, that would refer to the state of Israel, and the societies of the occupier's elite allies would refer particularly to the United States and the role they play in propping up Israel. And again, you know, if you took another example, let's take Kanaki, for instance. Kanaki or New Caledonia would be the occupied territory. The occupier's territory would be France, and then the societies of the occupier's elite allies would be those that provide material and diplomatic support to the state of France. Okay, let's look at other elements to domains. So it's really vital that strategists undermine the opponent's will to maintain their aggression. Now, the problem for self-determination struggles, and Johan Galtung has looked at this in a lot of depth, and more recently people at Chess Thurber have also examined this. The problem is that there's often a huge cultural and social distance between the resisting population and the occupiers or the power holders. So in the case of West Papua, you know, there's extreme racism at play, and in many cases, West Papuans are viewed as being inferior, and in some cases even less than human. Now, you add to that a massive geographic distance. West Papua's, the capital, Port Numbai of Jayapura, is some 3,000 kilometres from Jakarta. And Indonesians, ordinary Indonesians in general, know very little about West Papua and even less about indigenous people who live there. So what's critical in all of this is finding groups who can sympathise with the resisting population, but are closer culturally and socially to the oppressor, and can humanise the oppressor's challenges and help communicate their can humanise the challenges and help communicate their grievances to those in power. So this was the role that the white church played in the civil rights struggle in the US. It's the role that groups like Black Sash played in South Africa. Now, interestingly, this, in terms of this great chain of non-violence, which is what Galtung called it, others have called it a communication chain. It's ethnicity and culture is not the only, necessarily or the only important factor here. Class also plays a role, and so does power. So recently you can see the fact that the Solomon Islands government has stood up for the West Papuans, and the current Prime Minister, Manasseh Sogavare, has helped bring the United Liberation Movement for West Papua into the Melanesian Spearhead Group. You can see as a result of this kind of diplomatic work that the government of Indonesia has become much more interested in West Papua and addressing some of those issues. So there's an ethnic dimension and a cultural dimension around humanising the West Papuans, but there's also an important power dimension here too. Okay, so the other key thing in relation to strategy in these three different domains is undermining power. And this is all about straining or even severing the capability chain that supplies the Indonesian government. In the case of West Papua, the capability chain that supplies the Indonesian government, military and foreign and domestic corporations with much needed sources of power. So legitimacy, cash, labour, material and political support, reputation, raw materials, consumers, products. Now, capability chain is much more than a supply chain, for instance. But in relation to corporations in West Papua, you take Freeport, for example, and their capability chain is stretched thin. They're exposed in multiple locations and in multiple ways, economically, reputationally, logistic, and politically. And in the case of West Papua, extractive industries are often close in proximity to outraged indigenous populations. So corporations like BP, for instance, is also vulnerable. And these corporations could be targeted in ways that persuade various stakeholders to take action in support of Papuan demands. And we actually saw that in the case of Freeport. They've helped fund the Second Congress, for instance, in 2000. Okay, diplomacy. What I mean by diplomacy is political strategy, legal strategies, and human rights strategies. Now, these strategies can take place within conventional political structures, and they might use national, sub-regional, regional, or international fora, but they can also take place outside these structures. So in the case of the Melanesian Spearhead Group, which is an important sub-regional forum, you saw the West Papuans working through conventional politics, so working with the elected leaders and doing high-level lobbying work, but at the same time you also saw a build-up of support in the grassroots. And in the case of the Solomon Islands, the Solidarity Group there went from individual membership around about a dozen or so people to an organization that literally connected to every sector of the population there. Okay, now the purpose of diplomacy is to achieve intermediate goals. It's about building power, and it's also about expanding a sense of what's possible. Okay, and as I said before, that needs to take place in each of the three domains, inside and outside existing conventional political processes. All right, so social movement theory talks about political opportunities and threats. This is also vital for self-determination struggles. They need to maximize opportunities and minimize threats. So an example of an opportunity coming up in the case of the West Papuan struggle, this is APEC coming up in Papua New Guinea next year. This is a huge chance to put the international focus on West Papua. Another political opportunity is the brilliant organizing work that the United Liberation Movement for West Papua and their allies did around the Pacific Island Forum, and the way they actually pushed the forum to approach the government of Indonesia for a fact-finding mission. Now, there's a whole lot of opportunities to organize around that. An example of a threat would be the way the Indonesian government is militarizing the population. They're drawing more and more young people into military training. They're developing militia groups like LMRI, the Lembaga, what's the name of it? Lembaga Misi Reclassering Republik Indonesia, which is the institution for the re-education of people for the Republic of Indonesia. It's a Dutch Indonesian words there. And movements need to maximize opportunities and minimize threats whilst maintaining unity, because unity will be severely tested at these times. Okay, so let's just review, and I'm nearing to the end. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. Let's just review this framework. So you've got mass, which is about people, and diverse number of groups participating in the struggle. Remembering that, you have to get much more than, say, 3 to 5% of the resisting population. You probably want to push that up to much closer to half, perhaps even more, depending on the context. Momentum is about strategy, a coherent plan for success. Unity, we talked about that in terms of purpose, planning, and organization, and needing to do those, have those three things in, or have those three things in place in the three different domains: inside the occupier's territory, the occupied territory, inside the territory of the occupier, and also in the various countries that support the occupier, or in the places where they're wanting to expand their realm of influence. Then you need diplomacy, skilled diplomacy, and of course taking advantage of political opportunities and minimizing threats. So that's the draft conceptual and practical framework. In terms of next steps for this research or action, there's a real need to test this hypothesis through comparative research. So again, I'm not really interested in finding any kind of universal principle, but rather I'm wanting to understand the importance of these different components and how and why they intersect, and how these different mechanisms might come together to create pathways. And I'm curious about, what's missing from that conceptual framework as well. There's a couple of additional puzzles here. A key one is looking at how civil resistance interacts with political negotiations and UN intervention. And you can see this in relation to, say, South Sudan, East Timor, Kosovo. And I think this is a whole area that's been under-researched. I mean, some people are looking at doing some work on it now. And it's really important for struggles to look at how they maintain and strengthen their aspirations during this post-conflict period as well. Which relates to another puzzle. So making sure that post-conflict work is really in line with Indigenous visions of self-determination and isn't captured by state-centric interests and neoliberal interests, which sadly has happened all too often. Okay, so we're nearing the end now. Look, basically I'm arguing the self-determination struggles are a new frontier for both the research and action, and there's been incredible advances in the realm of anti-dictatorship struggles, and you've seen the success rates really go through the roof in the last 30 years. And it's time to extend that learning to other realms. So I'm looking forward to the time when we see those figures in Chenoweth and Stephan's study, those numbers for anti-occupation and succession struggles increase. And I think there's a good chance of that happening. Certainly resisting populations who desire freedom are not giving up. So, as my friends in West Papua would say, wah, 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 wah. Thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Great, thank you, Jason. Okay, so just to remind everybody, I will show people how they can ask questions. So in your GoToWebinar interface, there is the questions box where you can ask questions. And it looks like we have a few questions that have come in, and I will ask those to you, Jason, and feel free to answer. So the first one that we have says, what are the best sources for information about this struggle? It is not covered very much in Western media.
Yeah, great. You're quite right. It's it's a hidden struggle. It's been marginalized by mainstream media. Look, Free West Papua campaign, there's some resources on the ICNC website. There's a range of different solidarity groups around the world. Many of those are listed on the Free West Papua campaign website. There's a number of other websites, but that's probably a good place to start.
Okay, great. It looks like we have a few people that have their hands raised. So I will go ahead. Let's see. Ali, I just unmuted you. If you want to ask your question to Jason, feel free.
Hi, Jason. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Hello, Ali.
Hi. My question is about the diaspora population outside an occupied territory in the case of West Papua. I assume some members or some leaders of the movement from West Papua, they are in exile in Australia. I just wanted to know how this diaspora population have an impact on the self-determination. And also the second question would be on the diplomacy side from the Australian side. Which side Australia is taking in this? Of course, they have some diplomatic relations with Indonesia, but in the case of West Papua, where Australia stands, with West Papuans leaders living in Australia or with the Indonesian government? Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ali. Two excellent questions. So the first one was about the diaspora population. Now, the United Liberation Movement for West Papua has a really interesting structure. So there's 5 executive members, and they represent the 3 major struggle groups, and each one of those struggle groups is a coalition or an alliance themselves. So those 3 groups are the National Federal Republic of West Papua, the West Papua National Coalition for Liberation, and the National Parliament of West Papua, which includes the West Papua National Committee. Now, the executive all reside outside the country. So there's 2 members live in Australia, one in England, one in the US, and one in the Netherlands. However, the drivers of the struggle are inside West Papua, and the executive would be the first to acknowledge that. So there's a coordination council exists inside the country, and those 3 groups are exploring ways to coordinate and communicate together, and there's close and regular communication both between the diaspora and also people inside the country. But it is the folks inside the country who are driving it. They all chose folks in the diaspora to lead the struggle because the history has been that whenever a leader inside the country has stood up, Arnold App, Thomas Wangai, Tay Selaway, and others, they've been assassinated. So it's quite a practical consideration, and also the leaders outside the country have a better command of English and are able to freely travel to lobby various states. In terms of the Australian government, look, it's very depressing. Really, they are strong supporters of the Indonesian government's occupation, illegal occupation of West Papua, for a range of reasons, politically and economically. That might change. The Australian government changes position regularly. They've gone from supporting the Dutch during colonial periods to supporting Indonesia during the East Timor struggle. They supported Indonesia for many, many years and then backed the East Timorese. So, you know, history shows us that when popular movements inside Australia can gain enough leverage, they can persuade politicians to take an alternative position. Thank you.
All right, so we have another question. Herman, I just unmuted you if you would like to ask your question to Jason.
All right, okay, thank you for this time. I really admire my brother and also, of course, Dr. Jason MacLeod for his presentation. Yes, my name is Herman Weingam, and I'm committed for my people's struggle is nearly 26 years now as a freedom fighter, but also as one of the West Papuan leaders. And yeah, now I'm here in United States as a visiting scholar at one of the wonderful university here in United States called George Mason University. Through the facilitation, I've been working together with ICNC, International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and also with a couple of professors here. So it's very interesting to see what's happening in West Papua in terms of the what Jason MacLeod already described. And only I have two comments on it. It's just it's not criticism comment, but just for encourage everyone listen to what I already Jason mentioned. West Papua is a land with around like nearly 300 different languages. So when Jason MacLeod start with the West Papuan grid, they say wah wah wah. It's not West Papuan grid is for entire Papuan use. That's
Jason, it looks like your audio is cutting out. If you'd like, you can put your question into the question box and we can ask Jason that another way. So there's another question from Catherine. Catherine, you're unmuted.
David,
like to ask your question.
David, just before we go to Catherine, I just wanted to thank Herman for his comments and just emphasize again that it's people like Herman and other courageous leaders, you know, inside and outside the country who are driving the West Papuan struggle. And it's also, you know, people like Herman and other colleagues who really helped develop this framework as well. In some ways, I'm kind of presenting what I'm presenting to you now has really come out of a whole lot of collaborative research and dialogue with people involved in the struggle. Thank you.
All right, great. Catherine, you were unmuted if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, hi Jason. This is Catherine Hughes-Freitag. Hi, and I actually work with ICNC. And my brother, Bryn Hughes, has been at Queensland University, I think, has known you and spoke highly of you, so I'm excited.
Oh, yes, I know Bryn, great.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear your presentation. And I also wanted to say hello to Herman, who is also, as you said, an amazing human rights defender and someone I've been in touch with through my work with Peace Brigades International previously. My question is about kind of a number of different areas. I think this is really helpful to focus on nonviolent resistance and self-determination. I've worked on Palestine and Tibet and a number of other issues over the years, and in touch with many of those activists and organizers with ICNC, and just returned from a workshop in Palestine on these issues. So this is extremely helpful, and I think really is important kind of to have this other layer of research that is the same core but is also different and nuanced compared to like bringing down a dictator, for instance, or other kinds of anti-corruption struggles or things like that. So I've got three different areas of questions, all of which came up in the recent workshop and also my work in some of these areas. So one is around the issue of cultural resistance. And the importance of that in many of these areas where, as you said, people their cultures are being decimated or ignored, and there's a lot of racism, and it seems a key area is holding on to the culture through different types of cultural resistance, whether it's holding on to traditions or more modern types of art and dance and those kind of things to reach people. So that's one question, how you've looked at that as one of the tactics in these struggles. Another one is around boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So obviously in South Africa that was very effective. Obviously in the case of Palestine it's being tried, and I would just be curious to know if you found that to be a successful strategy or tactic with external actors that you've talked about, and how, yeah, so a kind of a broader maybe look at that issue. The other issue is around the co-optation of leadership. And as you've mentioned, it's so important to have that unity, and many of these areas, especially long-term occupations, it's very difficult when leadership becomes co-opted by either the occupier or other important allies. And then that's just one more layer for people to deal with and to struggle with and against. And so maybe a little bit of information if you've done any research on that. So those are I have lots more questions for you, but I'll stop at that for now.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, we could talk for a long time about each one of those areas. In terms of cultural resistance, absolutely. Just maintaining identity and values is an incredibly important part of the resistance, and that's certainly true for the West Papuans, and it's true for every other self-determination struggle that I'm aware of. Holding on to, Herman talked about before, the diversity of languages, 300 different languages, holding on to that, and other values and traditions, absolutely vital. Look, I haven't looked in great detail at how cultural resistance kind of flows into participation and development of strategy, but and unity, but it does play a key part in those three areas, and I think this is one of the fields where we just need a lot more research. And linked to that is also looking at everyday resistance. How do these individual streams of dissent, converge into a raging river of opposition? You also asked questions about the BDS, boycott, divestment, sanction strategy, and you talked about South Africa and Palestine. Look, my approach to tactics is really to look at the context first. I don't necessarily think that BDS as a strategy works in every single case. What's important is to look at where the sources of power are and designing tactics and strategies that really target those sources of power. Now, it may well be, BDS strategy. And certainly in the case of Palestine, I think that's a very, very effective strategy. For the self-determination struggles waged by Indigenous people on the Thai-Burma border, for instance, less so. Yeah. So again, it all depends on the context and where the power lies. You also talked or asked about co-option of leadership. Yeah, look, it's a big issue in any struggle. I think when I look at the West Papuan struggle, what I notice there is that that yes, unity is important, but it's not like the movement has to unify first and then progress. I think unity is an ongoing process. What I've noticed in the case of West Papua is it's young people or mid-level leadership, finding ways to come together across these different groups, building relationships, trust, having discussions about analysis and strategy and tactics, practicing on various actions together, working together on various campaigns. I mean, they're all really important ways of building unity. And I think if sometimes, if movements develop a very sound strategy with clear goals and a clear plan for achieving those goals, that can also help strengthen unity. And certainly that's, I think, been the case in the West Papua struggle. Some of the key leaders have come together. They focused on an intermediate goal, which was becoming a member of the Melanesian Spearhead Group, and that goal actually really helped unify and create the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, which is enduring way beyond that particular goal now. So anyway, that's my brief response to some of those questions. But thank you. Yeah, very, very good points you raised.
Okay, great. So we're going to take just one more question. There's quite a few more that are here, and we will send this to Jason afterward. But Kay, you are unmuted if you would like to ask Jason your question.
Hi, Jason. I really feel, how are you?
Good,
you certainly got me up early in the morning, didn't you? My key question in broadening out the agenda is in relation to other issues that are happening at an international level, like the fires that are burning. I feel that these international events which create chaos for other people are a means and mechanisms by which you can get the story out there.
Absolutely.
Because Singapore is not very happy about what's happening with the toxic fumes coming over from the into Indonesia from the fires. This would be a good opportunity if there were external supporters to visit the President of Singapore and try and find different ways of managing the issue from an international.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're exactly right. The forest fires currently raging in Indonesia is an example of a political opportunity, and for the first time you've got extensive forest fires in West Papua. Now this also ties into framing, which is a key part of strategy, and the West Papuan leaders are increasingly talking about West Papua as a climate change issue. Because you have, 75% of West Papua is forested. You're talking about the world's third largest forests after the Amazon and the Congo. And the key driver of deforestation in West Papua is the Indonesian military and the fact that customary land rights are not recognized. So, ending the occupation will also be a positive contribution to climate change. Now, some of the West Papuan leadership, particularly the leadership of the United Liberation Movement for West Papua, is talking about this, and they're making the links between the illegal occupation of West Papua and climate change, and using that, the opportunity of the fires, but also that framing to build allies with a whole range of people, particularly the Pacific, which is very vulnerable to climate change and is really at the forefront of the climate justice movement. So yes, great comment, Kay. Thank you.
All right, so I think that's all the time we have for questions. But if you have any other questions, feel free to send them to webinar at nonviolent-conflict.org. Or send them directly to me at dreinbold@nonviolent-conflict.org. A recording of the webinar will be available soon on our website, and we will take all the questions that were asked today in the questions pane and forward those on to Jason so he can answer them. And again, if you have any other questions, feel free to email them directly to us. I just want to say thank you, Jason, for the really terrific presentation today, and everybody have a good day.
Thanks, David, and thanks very much to everyone who joined us and to everyone who listens to the recording.
All right, great.
Stay well.